It rarely starts with a decision to betray. More often, it begins with a feeling that doesn't fit neatly inside the promise that was made. You're still there, still committed on the surface, still living the life that was agreed upon. And yet, something inside keeps drifting. There is affection. There is care. Sometimes there is even love. Nothing looks obviously broken. That's what makes it confusing. You're not unhappy enough to leave. You're not distant enough to be gone. You're simply not as contained as you thought you were. Then, there's the moment. A glance held a little longer than it should be. A conversation that feels lighter, more charged, more alive. Not because the other person is extraordinary, but because the feeling is. It reminds you of something you haven't felt in a while, or something you never fully lost. You don't frame this as betrayal. Not yet. You tell yourself it's harmless, temporary. Just attention, just curiosity. You still go home, you still show up, you still keep the structure intact. From the outside, nothing has changed. Inside, however, there's a quiet split. One part of you remains loyal to the life you built. The other part starts responding to a pull you didn't plan for. You don't announce this division. You live with it silently, letting both sides exist without fully confronting each other. You may even feel sincere in both places. Sincere when you say you care. Sincere when you say you didn't mean for anything to happen. There is no villain here, at least not in your own story. Just a slow loosening of a line that once felt clear. Desire doesn't arrive as an argument. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't care about timing or agreements. It shows up as a sensation, a possibility, a reminder that you are still responsive, still open, still affected. At first, you believe you can manage it. Keep it contained, enjoy the feeling without letting it change anything. You don't want to lose what you have. You also don't want to give up what you're feeling now. So you try to hold both. This is where things start to tilt. Not because you don't know the rules, but because the rules no longer match your inner state. The contract remains intact on paper. Inside, it has already been stretched. You might feel guilt, or you might feel strangely calm, sometimes both. There is often a sense of secrecy, not for drama, but for preservation. If no one knows, maybe nothing is truly happening. But something is happening, not outwardly yet, inwardly. A shift, a quiet permission forming. The promise still exists, but it's no longer the only thing guiding you. This is not the moment of betrayal. It's the moment before, when desire begins to live alongside commitment and the distance between them starts to matter. Jung would look at this not as a failure of morality, but as a split in the psyche. A promise was made consciously, but not all parts of the self were present when it was made. Something remained outside the agreement, unspoken, unintegrated. From this view, staying faithful requires more than intention. It requires inner alignment. When desire emerges elsewhere, Jung would not rush to label it betrayal. He would ask what part of the person is speaking now and why it was silent before. The psyche is not a single voice. It is a collection of tendencies, needs, fears, and longings that don't always agree with each other. Commitment often comes from the part that wants stability, continuity, a coherent life. Desire may come from a different layer altogether, one that feels neglected, constrained, or simply unseen. When these parts are not in dialogue, they act independently. The conscious self believes it has chosen a path. The unconscious self continues to move on its own. Jung would say this is where the split begins, not between people, but within the person. Desire, in this sense, is not just about attraction, it is about vitality. about feeling alive, responsive, mirrored. When that energy is not fully lived within the committed life, it doesn't disappear. It looks for expression elsewhere. Jung would notice how often people are genuinely surprised by their own behavior. "I didn't plan this. This isn't who I am." These statements are not always excuses. They can be accurate descriptions of inner division. One part acted while another watched. He would also point out that guilt often arrives after the fact, not as prevention, but as a reaction to the realization that the self is not as unified as it believed. The discomfort comes not only from having crossed a boundary, but from discovering that the boundary did not hold internally. Jung would not suggest suppressing desire as a solution. Suppression deepens the split. Nor would he suggest indulging it without consequence. That only shifts the imbalance elsewhere. Integration is the work here, bringing the disowned part into awareness, allowing it to speak before it acts. But integration is slow. It requires honesty without justification. It asks the person to face what the commitment did not include, what it asked them to give up without fully acknowledging the cost. From Jung's lens, infidelity is not the beginning of the problem. It is the symptom. The psyche announcing that something essential was left out of the original agreement. Until that inner conversation happens, the split remains, and desire continues to move on its own, quietly undermining the promise that was meant to contain it. Nietzsche would question the promise itself, not to excuse breaking it, but to examine how it was formed. He was suspicious of vows made in the name of virtue rather than truth. A contract that asks someone to deny a part of their nature does not dissolve that part. It only drives it underground. From this view, infidelity is not simply desire overpowering discipline. It is often the return of something that was never honestly included. The promise was made by the part of the person that wanted order, respectability, coherence. Another part stayed silent, not because it agreed, but because it wasn't asked. Nietzsche would notice how society frames fidelity as a moral achievement. To stay faithful is praised as strength. To fail is condemned as weakness. But he would ask whether this framing hides a deeper problem. When desire appears, it is treated as an enemy to be defeated rather than a signal to be understood. He would say that many promises are made against one's own vitality, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of chaos, fear of instability, fear of being seen as unfinished. The promise becomes a way to secure an identity, a way to say, "This is who I am now," even if that statement is premature. When desire breaks the contract, Nietzsche would not rush to shame. He would see a clash between lived experience and imposed values. The person did not suddenly become unfaithful. They became honest in a way the structure could not accommodate. This is why betrayal often arrives quietly. No declaration, no rebellion, just a private crossing of a line that had already been weakened internally. The moral language comes later. The guilt, the explanations, the self-judgment. All attempts to restore a story that no longer fits. Nietzsche would also point out how much energy goes into maintaining appearances. Remaining faithful outwardly while inwardly divided is exhausting. When the split becomes unbearable, action follows. Not always consciously, not always deliberately, but inevitably. He would not celebrate this. He did not celebrate collapse, but he would insist on clarity. A promise that survives only through repression is fragile. A morality that requires constant denial produces resentment, secrecy, and fracture. From this lens, the real question is not why someone failed to stay faithful. It is why the promise demanded more than the person could honestly give. Why desire was treated as something to eliminate rather than something to integrate. Nietzsche would say that fidelity, when it is real, grows from alignment, not obedience. When desire and commitment are not enemies, there is no drama, no hidden life, no quiet betrayal. When they are enemies, the outcome is not a moral failure, it is a structural one. A life built on a promise that never included the whole person, and desire, sooner or later, will expose that omission. Fromm would look at this situation and move away from desire itself, not to deny it, but to ask what it is being used for. For him, betrayal is often less about wanting someone else and more about wanting relief from something heavier, responsibility, limitation, or the weight of being fully chosen and fully choosing in return. He believed many people long for intimacy but fear the demands that come with it. Commitment asks for presence, consistency, and a narrowing of possibility. It asks a person to live inside one life instead of several imagined ones. For some, that narrowing feels suffocating, even when the relationship itself is caring and stable. From this perspective, cheating is not always an act of excess. It can be an act of escape. The person is not necessarily chasing pleasure. They are stepping away from the pressure of being accountable to one bond, one story, one version of themselves. Fromm would notice how often people who betray do not leave. They stay. They maintain the relationship. They continue participating in shared routines. This is not because they are cruel, but because they still need the safety that commitment provides. The betrayal becomes a way to breathe without dismantling the structure that holds them. He would also point out how modern relationships are asked to carry enormous weight. We expect one person to provide emotional security, passion, meaning, companionship, and identity reinforcement. When any of these feels lacking, the impulse is not always to renegotiate honestly. It is often to supplement quietly. In that sense, betrayal is a symptom of unresolved tension between freedom and belonging. The person wants closeness without enclosure, desire without consequence, expansion without loss. Fromm would say this is not immaturity in the childish sense, but an unresolved conflict between wanting to be held and wanting to remain unbound. He would also notice how guilt functions here. Guilt often appears not because the person has harmed another, but because they sense their dependence. They know they are drawing from two sources while committing fully to neither. The discomfort comes from imbalance, not just morality. Fromm would resist simplifying this into blame. He was careful with human contradictions. He would say that many people are not taught how to hold freedom and commitment at the same time. They are taught to choose one, then quietly smuggle the other in through secrecy. What suffers most in this pattern is not desire, but honesty. The relationship becomes less about mutual presence and more about management, keeping things from collapsing, keeping options open, keeping the self from feeling trapped. From Fromm's lens, staying faithful is not about restraint. It is about the ability to remain present inside limitation without needing to escape it. When that capacity is missing, betrayal becomes a workaround. Not because the person does not care, but because they do not know how to stay whole inside one choice. Camus would approach this without moral heat, not to excuse and not to condemn. He would look at the act of not staying faithful as a human response to a condition that feels unbearable when lived honestly. Not everyone breaks promises because they want more. Some break them because they cannot live inside what they already have without fracturing. He was interested in how people live with contradiction, how they carry opposing truths without resolving them. In this case, the truth of commitment and the truth of desire exist at the same time. Camus would not rush to reconcile them. He would accept that they can coexist painfully without synthesis. From this lens, infidelity is not always rebellion. Often, it is an attempt to feel alive without destroying one's life, a compromise that fails. The person does not want to leave, but they also cannot remain fully present, so they step sideways instead of forward or back. Camus understood that many people do not act out of ideology, but out of exhaustion. The exhaustion of holding one version of themselves in place while another keeps knocking. Desire becomes a reminder that something inside has not been accounted for, not honored, not lived. He would resist turning this into a lesson. There is no recommendation here, no should have, just an observation of what happens when a life asks for coherence that the person cannot yet provide. What matters to Camus is not the rule that was broken, but the inner stance. Is the person lying to themselves, or are they quietly aware of the contradiction they are living with? These are not the same. One is avoidance. The other is lucidity without resolution. Camus believed that dignity does not come from purity. It comes from refusing false comfort. For some, pretending to be fully faithful would be the false comfort. For others, acting on desire would be. He would not rank these positions. He would only note where honesty stops and performance begins. There is also the cost. Camus never ignored cost. Living divided extracts something: guilt, distance, a thinning of presence. Even when nothing is discovered, something is lost internally. The person knows they are not fully where they appear to be. But Camus would say that human life is often lived in these partial states, between what we can promise and what we can sustain, between who we say we are and who we are becoming. Infidelity, in this light, is not an identity. It is a moment where the gap becomes visible. The tragedy is not the desire, and not even the broken promise. The tragedy is living a life that cannot yet hold the whole person inside it. Camus would leave it there. No closure, no verdict. Just the quiet recognition that sometimes desire breaks the contract, not because it is stronger than commitment, but because commitment was never wide enough to contain the life beneath it.